that kind of brings me on to our webinar, Surviving Software Delivery in 2025. Let's get started. Firstly, I'm super excited to have everyone here today. I think we've got a really great presentation. We've got some really great speakers, which brings me about to introduce them. So today we have, as you can see, James Walker and Rich Jordan with me, both of my colleagues. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'll go first this time, Rich. So yeah, super excited about this webinar today. Thank you for that, Mantas, and thank you for everyone joining. So my name's James Walker. I'm one of the co-founders and CEO of Curiosity Software. I've been in IT for just over a decade now, which is probably slightly less than Rich. But we've had Curiosity. We've been going for about 6 years now. I think the fun never stops in IT. There's always some new technology or some new process coming out. I spend most of my time talking with industry leaders and a specific focus on helping enterprises with software delivery and also productivity across delivery as well.
Awesome.
So hi everyone, just to reiterate what James said in terms of welcome everyone, great to meet and talk to you today. So my name is Rich Jordan. I am a solutions architect here in Curiosity. He's correct. I've been in IT for about 20 years now. I know my looks don't show it, but I have. There you go. And mainly working within financial services within the realm of QA, very similar to James's experiences, looking at efficiency. What does quality mean in terms of measures? A lot of the things we are going to talk to you about today, I think you will resonate with if you are kind of in IT for any period of time, be that short or long.
Awesome. Thank you, Rich. Thank you, James. Great to have you here today. So before we get started with the main bit of content, we do have a poll going on. I'd love to get everyone's answers on that poll if you just hit the interactions column on the right-hand side of your screen. But I'd also love to get Rich and James, your opinions and your experience with customers and teams that you talk to about this question. So the question is, how often do you encounter delays in your release cycle due to issues in requirements, testing, data, or environment setup? So issues in the outer loop of software delivery. James, if you want to go.
It's a great question. I'm interested to see the results when they come through. Look, I think from my perspective, I don't think I've seen any organization who have got this absolutely right. I think it's always a challenge for organizations. Either there's too much detail and you've got some kind of requirements document which is 200 pages long, or often there's just not enough detail, right? And that just impacts all of software delivery, which is kind of what we're going to be talking about today, I guess. But I don't think I've ever seen any organization get it right. Delivery is a constant iteration, it's a constant improvement. How about you, Rich? What do you
I'd agree. I think you should expect to understand these challenges and try and stay on top of them. As you've said, IT change is an iterative process. It's very hard to predict what will come next, and so unless you have the right levers in place to keep on top of change, understand risk, basically tame complexity, you are always going to struggle and have difficulties. I think the main part on this is how good are you at understanding where those gaps exist and then closing that gap, rather than letting that gap grow and grow and grow over time.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you, guys. So yeah, I'd like to now, get started and hand over to James, who's going to kick off the presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Mantas. Yeah, so there's quite a compelling statistic at the top of this slide, I guess. Gartner says 80% of software projects fail. I think when I first started in the industry, and I saw a very similar statistic to this, I'm going to mask my language slightly. I kind of thought, what a load of rubbish. I can't believe, software is this difficult. I can't believe so many organizations are kind of falling short of delivering successfully, right? And I think having now been in IT for slightly less time than Rich, I almost feel like this understates kind of the state of the industry, right? And I think, a lot of this is coming back to the definition of failure, I guess. Do 80% of projects end up in some kind of catastrophic state? Probably not. But if I look at this from the other hand, do I think that 20% of software projects are insanely successful and should be a blueprint for other organizations to follow and really are, the definition of success and they've absolutely nailed it? And I almost think absolutely not, right? Almost every project I see has at least kind of one of the symptoms that is listed on this slide, right? It's delayed, it's plagued with quality issues, there are compliance risks, we're using production data in test or dev environments. There's an overwhelming amount of technical debt. Our teams, are miscommunicating, they're working in silos, we're over budget, we're releasing too slow. And I think, it's very common whenever you talk to anyone in the IT industry, there is some kind of complaint along those lines, right? And I think, the result of that is software delivery is extremely hard. I actually don't think there's any other industry quite like it, especially when you think about all the new processes, all the new, way of developing that exists today, right? Rich said at the beginning, change. And I think, in IT, we have such a huge amount of change, right? If I think about it for another industry, it could be we're out there, we're a house builder or some kind of construction person, for instance, right? On day one, you build a nice house because that's what fits your requirements and that's what you need, right? On day two, you wake up, your needs evolve, and suddenly, that house has to become a skyscraper. So you start, reinforcing the foundation, you start, building higher, building taller, adding lots of steel everywhere, etc. And then, next week, the priorities have shifted again. We need to be able to transport and live, on water or, some other kind of mechanism. So now we need to transform our skyscraper into a boat. We need to adapt it. We need to repurpose the materials, redesign everything, all while ensuring, our house skyscraper doesn't collapse in the process, right? And that's really how we live in IT, right? Requirements change all the time, release on release, sprint on sprint. We've got new things, new capabilities being thrown at us all the time. And I think the pressure and intensity that teams, face is huge. It's really, really challenging environment to operate in. What we've been doing at Curiosity is we've actually, and if you've been following us, you will have seen this, these two circles appear quite a bit. But what we've come up with is a new concept to explain software delivery. And what we're trying to do is help teams understand the challenges they face and almost peel back those challenges to go back to the root causes to help organizations set themselves up for success, right? And that's where we've come up with this new concept that we're calling the inner outer loop. Okay. Now, if you look at this, the inner loop is really the world of development, right? So there's things in here like building, debugging, pull requests, etc. It's the day-to-day life of a developer, right? The other piece here on the right-hand side is the outer loop. Okay, and the outer loop is all of the supporting pieces for delivery, right? So we've got things in here like requirements, really, really important. You've got things in here like test cases, how are we going to test the software? You've got things in here like data, how are we going to have the data to test and develop with? Environments, really critical to testing, right? So the outer loop is kind of all of these supporting pieces that drive software delivery and drive the, essentially the creation of a software asset, right? And the issue we see in a lot of organizations is there's been such a huge focus on what I would call the world of the developer. You speak to a lot of execs, you look at a lot of initiatives in organizations, and it's all about how can we improve developer experience? How can we make developers happier, want to come to work, have a really good experience when they're developing? How can we improve developer productivity? So, we're improving the amount of features that go for every sprint. We're increasing our code count, whatever that KPI is that we're measuring for productivity, we're focusing on that and we're trying to improve it, right? And what we've seen in a lot of organizations is there's such a heavy focus on this inner loop because we're focusing on developer productivity, but this outer loop, which has all of the really important supporting assets, almost gets abandoned and doesn't get the same level of support, which is such a shame, right? If you're involved in a project, it's not unusual to hear, our testing budget has been cut. We've lost testing resources from our team. We don't have the business analysts or the product owners we need to actually go out and, really focus on this really hard business problem we have, right? So that's kind of number one. Number two, what we see that ends up happening is the inner loop needs a constant stream of high quality assets, right? If you're a developer, you need to be fed high quality requirements. You need to have the data in place for you to develop against. And when that's neglected, over time, you have pain across the entire software delivery. And we're going to talk about a lot of that pain today and some of our experiences. But ultimately, what ends up happening is release velocity goes down. You have the wrong requirements. Your team faces a lot of rework. Quality goes down because we're building the wrong thing. There's not enough time for testing, which is, again, another driver of poor quality. The team is spending all their time firefighting defects. We're losing talent. We can't innovate, so we lose market share. And really, when we don't have the inner and outer loop aligned, and we're not giving enough focus on them both, all of software delivery struggles. And often this is the root cause for a lot of the pains I was talking about that we hear from organizations. Now, just diving a little bit kind of deeper, I suppose, into this challenge we're seeing in a lot of organizations. I've said it, most organizations overinvest in development, right? And what has led from that is developers can move incredibly fast. I've never heard a developer complain and say they can't code fast enough. And the reason behind that is, there's such a wealth of libraries that developers can pull in now and develop new capabilities, right? Copilot and all these AI technologies that are coming out are fantastic. Developers can literally go in, ask a Copilot, ask some kind of AI agent to write some code. Yes, it needs tidying up a little bit. It's not perfect, but to go from zero to something incredibly fast, right? And if we underinvest in this inner loop, the demand from the development world for high quality assets is extremely high. If I'm coding faster, I need to have more requirements so that I can, fulfill my demand. If I'm pushing out more code, I have a lot more stuff that needs to be tested, right? And what we typically see is that, corners get cut, technical debt grows, quality and productivity is both hit. And, that's evident across software delivery, and that's the reason for a lot of the pains that we're seeing. Now, this webinar is specifically about software delivery in 2025. And I think, what we're going to see in 2025 is this is going to be amplified beyond belief, right? Most developers are already using AI every day. Just this morning, I watched a developer literally take, they were doing some migration work, converting AngularJS over to Angular, and there was this one component, I estimate it probably would have taken them about 2 days to go through and take this series of components and convert it over to the newer code, right? But they put it into ChatGPT, the latest model, I think it's O1 preview or the similar model. And basically they typed this in, it went away and thought about it for a minute, and it came back with this huge chunk of migrated code. It needed cleaning up, it had a couple of compile errors, but all of a sudden it took that 2 days work, probably down to about 1 hour, right? If you think about the ROI on that, and you think about, the level that development and the speed it's able to move at, this imbalance is just going to become larger and larger as these AI models, LLMs, just get more powerful, right? Developers are just going to get more and more faster. Now, there's kind of a bit of a joke in the industry at the moment that, every day a developer spends coding with AI, it takes 2 days to test it, clean it up, and, make sure that there's actually quality baked into that code, right? Now, this pretty much sums up, at least my thinking. Rich, I know, agrees with this as well. The world of the developer, it's becoming a more and more solved problem, right? Coding is not hard if you've got the right people in there, but everything else in this outer loop is incredibly challenging. It's incredibly hard to get right. All the time I hear organizations complain about how bad their requirements are. I rarely hear organizations say we have good requirements. I rarely hear organizations say, we don't use any production data in our test and development environments. And it's the same with testing, right? I've never heard an organization, or at least, speaking the truth, say we have 100% test coverage, we have 100% confidence every time we release. And that really comes down to this inner outer loop imbalance. And I really think, it's just going to get worse in 2025. But anyway, Rich, I'm going to hand over to you and let's talk about some more challenges.
Yeah, cool. Cheers, James. So just to kind of double down on what James was saying, it really becomes about your end-to-end flow, right? Just concentrating on your inner loop in a kind of an end-to-end software development lifecycle. You're going to get slow, maybe a bit quick, and then slow again, right? So you really got to pay attention to the overall flow of your team rather than just the kind of the very technical nuts and bolts of code, right? So what we're going to talk about here is, you might have listened to kind of some of the things James said about the inner and outer loop, and maybe you've kind of drawn a parallel with some of your own working practices, what you see. What we're doing in the next part, and we've drawn up a bit of a kind of a white paper takeaway off the back of this webinar, which I'm sure you'll get links to, which is the kind of the top 10 symptoms that you'll see if you've got challenges around your inner and outer loop misalignment. So what we're going to do, because we'll run out of time if we try and go through all 10, is we've got the top 5 as we see them, and we're going to talk about what are those challenges, and towards the end we're going to talk about what are some of the solutions that you might put in place. Okay, so as you can see on the slide, the first common challenge around the outer loop misalignment is miscommunication and rework. All right, so as I mentioned, I've been in IT for 20 years, and not once have I seen it true that there has been in-date or complete artifacts that we can actually work off. And again, you're kind of in a place of saying, why would you expect to find those things, right? You could argue that if you spent all that time putting together lots and lots of requirements up front, you're only producing things that will change into the future. You are spending too much time articulating what might not become true. All right, so it's not about understanding these things up front. It's having the ability to capture, evolve, understanding of how the system and the requirements should exist as you go through that software development lifecycle. All right, one of the problems around where artifacts either are out of date or don't exist at all is that a lot of the time you find that there is a lot of head knowledge within the organization. All right, so we all know the SMEs that have been in the organization for 20 or 30 years that know how system A works, right? And they are the only people that know how system A works. And so how can I, as a project and one project in a queue of projects that need access to this person, get that time with them and also get that head knowledge out of them in the context that's relevant to me? All right, so what we start to understand through that person with a lot of head knowledge is that they only really understand the context of the system through their own very siloed working practices of that system. All right, so quite often you find that actually, whilst they have good understanding of the business requirements or the business rules of that system, they don't necessarily understand the interfaces to system A talking to another system. So there's real challenges there in terms of miscommunication. All right. And as we start to build these things up, we start to talk about things like technical debt and the kind of evolving distance between knowing how a system should work and actually how it does work. And so again, we miscommunicate things. We maybe articulate artifacts in the wrong way, and that exemplifies the problem. And this leads to ultimately a lot of rework, a lot of costly redesign. Ultimately, we're talking about a big ball of mess when it comes to understanding how change should happen and making it in a predictable and repeatable way. All right, so we start to get ourselves into a bit of a muddle when it comes to how do we solve these problems. So we end up going into lots of costly and timely meetings where we get a whole cast of people. I'm sure lots of people are fed up with going into lots and lots of meetings talking about things that are relevant sometimes and aren't relevant other times, and talking about things that we've already spoken about a lot of times, and lots of conjecture about how something should work and how something shouldn't work, where we think that actually we should really have documented and known these things already, or at least had decent ways of capturing these things. All right, so it all leads to a whole big mess of miscommunication and misunderstanding, which in turn leads to a hell of a lot of waste in terms of cost, rework, time, and bugs, let's face it. James, I'm interested in your experiences in terms of talking to customers around kind of their experiences. Does anybody get it right?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, from my perspective, I do think this used to be a little bit easier when we were kind of all in the same office, or at least not, having these kind of hybrid working environments. And I think now it's just, I think every organization is facing this in some shape or form, right? And I don't think any organization has it right at the moment. To me, it's almost a bit of a silent killer. If you don't have your requirements right, everything downstream gets impacted from it. Your testing gets impacted, your data gets impacted, your developers get impacted. Best case, as you said there, Rich, you end up having lots of clarification meetings, or maybe you've got developers who are, absolute superheroes who can fill in the gaps. But most organizations I speak to complain that they have too many meetings and their requirements aren't good enough. I think worst case, the wrong thing gets built. But I think honestly, that is mostly when there is such a lack of communication that happens. Most of the time it's just, an abundance of clarification meetings and people having to talk to understand what's happening, right? Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I've been reading a lot recently about developer flow. And maybe some people on the webinar haven't heard that before, but that's really, giving developers time and space to concentrate, because, every single time you have to context switch or you have to go away, there's like an hour buffer either side of a meeting where someone is, basically not in that kind of mindset of being able to solve a problem, move forward and be productive, right?
Yeah.
So I do think it's kind of a silent killer from a perspective. I don't know if you've seen similar things, Rich.
I think building on your point, I think often organizations struggle to find a happy medium between almost, the traditional document everything in very static mediums to document nothing, right? And so there is to me there is a happy medium, which is as you're going through that clarification process, all right, and this is not around necessarily writing requirements, as we've already discussed, right? IT change is an evolving, emergent practice, right? And so as you have your working practices where inevitably you'll have things like Three Amigos conversations, how do you use tooling technology to capture these things in an as frictionless way as you can, right? And so rather than having to go away and do static documentation, which really doesn't work for you, how can you use technology that becomes a living, breathing specification that actually is more valuable to you, right? It can tell you how, if I make a big change here, this is the impact you will realize, right? And so there is a lot more value to the reason why you'd want to do some of these practices rather than I need to do it because the process tells me to do it, or actually we think it's a good idea to write this in a Word document, but actually we all know we're going to put it on the shelf and never look at it again. So I think there's that in terms of, to me, bumping up the value around why would we want to capture these things. What does experimentation mean, right? Experimentation doesn't necessarily mean I need to go and write the product straight away. I might experiment through some kind of conceptual model, right? And how do you change that to be a far more valuable exercise rather than kind of skip the design thinking and get into coding?
Yeah, I agree fully with you, Rich. I'm just thinking ahead as well into kind of next year and beyond, where we're going to see things go from this perspective, I guess. And there's one scary thing in my head, and there's potentially one good thing as well. And I'd love to get your thoughts on that as well. But I think one thing from me, which kind of scares me a little bit, is, people just blindly using AI to kind of pad out requirements. And it's going to happen, right? Like, I think we've all been guilty of using AI too much. But you almost get to a perspective then where you're just adding words for the sake of it, and it's not really that helpful, right? So I think that's a danger. But I think the pro here is, if you looked at it, that you almost had kind of a virtual SME, a virtual assistant, maybe it's trained on the organization's data. Actually, that could be hugely empowering, right? Because then you're taking all of these, sources of knowledge, essentially, you're condensing them down in some kind of virtual assistant, which you can then interrogate to try and reduce technical debt, right? So you could go into the AI and you could say, I want to understand how my settlement system works for this particular type of foreign transaction over this amount. It comes back, it lets you know, and that's amazing, right? But I think there's pros and cons we're going to see next year potentially, right?
Absolutely. There's an interesting point to which the underlying thing here is essentially we're talking about in terms of challenge around flow and miscommunication, rework, is that the fundamental challenge is we don't really understand how something works,
Right.
and so it's very odd to defer that to an artificial intelligence that is essentially working off a base of knowledge which isn't understood. I think to your point, as and when we start to realize that and grow up, I don't mean us grow up, I mean grow up a body of knowledge, a bit like I was talking there about the kind of the living, breathing specification, a structured understanding about how design should work, how rules should work within the system we're trying to build. That's when AI can start to thrive, right? Because it has context that it can then build upon. Without any of that stuff, or without out-of-date documentation that isn't actually an articulation of what we're trying to do, it can only get it wrong. So we might be, to your point, creating, for that, days worth of AI development, we might be creating even more than 2 or 3 days worth of testing. We might be creating a whole kind of rework schedule if we try and use AI too fast, too quickly.
Yeah, it's interesting. All right, should we move on to the next one?
Yep.
What have we got next?
So the next one we're talking about is a lack of measurability and release confidence. All right, so it's on a similar theme in terms of, I think you touched on it earlier on, when we're doing things like coming out of kind of release change into kind of implementation, one of the things that will commonly get asked as a project making change is, what was the test coverage that you actually achieved? All right, I think it's really interesting that there's a bit of a myth there around what does coverage of test even mean, and how does that team actually achieve it? And I think there is a real challenge in individual project teams and organizations with testing capabilities, for example, or build capabilities around how they actually measure those things to be anything other than a kind of a glory metric, if you like, rather than something meaningful that articulates either the quality of the system or the risk of making change. Yeah. So again, we're talking about how do you build out coverage capability when underpinning it, you don't really have any documents or requirements or understanding of the system to trace back to. So how do you measure those things? And it's a real challenge, right? How do you get to a point where you have a mechanism commonly understood across the organization? So again, what does 100% coverage actually mean? Are we tracing back to, requirements to which we know there is only very few and they are a poor articulation of the system, or actually trying to go to a much more objective measure of coverage, i.e., from a development point of view, we might be looking at code coverage, for example. From a testing point of view, we might be looking at more sophisticated algorithms like pairwise coverage around models or scenarios of test cases around that. So big challenge around outer loop activities is what are we trying to measure, and ultimately why are we doing all of these things on the outside, right? And I think this is possibly a fundamental reason why the outer loop possibly is neglected by stakeholders today, because code is very measurable by the very nature. It's very structured, you can see an outcome, but actually design work, testing work, requirements elicitation work, it's not that measurable, and so there is a real challenge or real challenge in focus in getting attention and therefore spend when it comes to investing in the outer loop. James, I'm interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, I see it in the bottom right there, vanity metrics, which is one of my favorite topics. I did a LinkedIn post on this a while ago, and I think it hit like 50,000 views or something, which, yeah, I guess that's kind of a vanity metric in itself. But look, it obviously resonated, right? And I don't hear this so much now when I talk to people in the industry, but if I go back 4 or 5 years ago, I certainly did. People love talking about, what percentage of their tests are automated. To your point, what level of coverage do I have? And you take a step back and what does that actually mean? Like, is it actually adding value to the business? Is it de-risking the release? Is it giving you confidence? And you start to dig into those questions, and actually, you start to peel apart those numbers and realize that, yes, it's a great metric you can report on to management, but actually quality is still a significant issue within this team, right? I don't see that so much anymore. I think, often people have good measures now that they're looking at, especially for kind of impactful metrics, right, which tie back to kind of business objectives like defect leakage, customer satisfaction scores, whatever that may be, right? Like I think people have a good hold on that. I think one of the big issues I see at the moment is teams having such a spread of tools around their IT landscape, I guess you would call it, right? The requirements are stored in one system, the test cases, a little bit's in Jira, some of it's in Excel. We've got a couple of test cases in another system. None of it talks to each other. It's very dispersed. And in my mind, I just think if you have all of this different technology, you're storing all of these different bits of data all over the place, how can you truly understand kind of the impact of a change, right? How can you truly understand where you need to focus your testing efforts? And how can you bring all of this together to almost say, am I confident in my release? Do I believe I have, or I'm getting good software quality out of the back end, right? And I think that's actually where a lot of teams are struggling at the moment. We've almost gone the other way. We've got so much technology, we've almost got too much. And now what I'm seeing in a lot of organizations is almost consolidation. We're trying to move towards using Jira for more of our IT systems. We're using more plugins so that we're connecting the data and we're bringing it into one system, right? And the benefit there is it's much easier to do reporting. It's truly much easier to understand change. And I think that's a benefit. And I think we're going to see a lot more teams focus on that as it goes forward, right?
I agree to a certain extent in terms of there is far more metric. I'm interested, especially in terms of the reaction you got to the vanity metric.
Okay.
In terms of, I'm going to challenge your assertion that it's got better, because I think there is more metric. I think there is still a hell of a lot of vanity metric going on, and I think teams are really still struggling around. Ultimately, if you boil down testing to its very simplest form, I need to provide feedback around this level of coverage, and that's about all you need to do, right? Is it good? Is it bad? That's all you need to do. But I think teams will really, really struggle to do that.
Yeah, I think, maybe I've misspoken here. So I think in my head, there's an awareness that those are vanity metrics, I guess. Like, I feel like maybe it's just the people I surround myself with. I don't know. That might be a problem. But when I do talk to people now, a lot of people have been bit several times by, we must automate everything and all of these kind of, weird things that are associated with these vanity metrics, right, to try and achieve them. I think people are more aware of what the good metrics are, what they should be tracking. But I think, to your point, actually tracking them and doing a good job of them, that is still a challenge, 100%.
I think the interesting point is everybody knows it, right? It's just hard. It's just hard to change or hard to get those building blocks in place. I think ultimately, ironically, that's why we're talking about the outer loop, right? In that some of these things are very hard because either they don't get the focus that they need, still too often. The direction from the top is I need automation numbers from the test because that's what good testing means. But also one of the biggest challenges is kind of because we've been working this way for a long, long time. It's very hard to change those working practices in order to elicit the metrics that we actually want, right? So, all right, I know I want some decent coverage metrics based on, a level of coverage around requirements, but my coverage of my requirements aren't great. That's easier said than done to actually change that, right? Because that might not be your area of influence, or actually to do requirements or put together a process to capture an emergent requirement is quite hard. And so this is where we need to focus on, kind of what are those best practices and therefore what are the metric that we want to get out of the back of those to ultimately articulate what coverage is and have we met it? And everything else is just waste.
I agree. I fully agree with you, Rich. All right, number 3. Let's have a look.
So the next one is around growing complexity. So again, we've touched on some of these themes already. As we make change and, agile and smaller iterative ways of working is only accelerating this process. We make change, we potentially add more complexity around our understanding of the system, or even complexity to the system, right? Quite often, organizations struggle to decommission anything, and therefore IT change just means add to what exists. And so if you've got an IT estate of 30, 40 years, which most financial services organizations have, you are really struggling with this problem. If you are a kind of a startup organization that has possibly 6 months worth, a year's worth of development and therefore systems, you might be starting to feel this pain. But in another 6 months' time, another year's time, you really start to feel this pain. And this is where the systems complexity, growing uncertainty around how a system works or how it interfaces with another system within your organization, it really becomes a problem, right? And to James's point, not just around agile, but AI, for example, is just going to accelerate that challenge around how fast change and systems complexity is happening. How are you going to stay on top of that, right? Because as soon as you start to drop the ball, to use that phrase, you will start to lose a grip around systems understanding, systems risk, change understanding, all right? And things at the bottom there around poor traceability, inaccessible knowledge, they will just start to manifest themselves in a more louder way. And so putting the right levers in place to understand and stay on top of these things is really, really key. We've said in this slide here some of the symptoms of the different roles that you might see within teams. I'm sure that many people will kind of recognize some of the phrases we're saying, but ultimately, and the picture is quite a good one in terms of, we are making a small change. Why the hell does it take so long, right? I'm sure anybody working in a change team has been pressurized or pushed by senior stakeholders, product owners, around why do these things take so long. This is all symptoms of a problem around neglecting outer loop challenges, understanding complexity, all of these good things that ultimately make even small changes really, really complicated. James, interested in your thoughts?
We could be on this slide for a while. Look, I think the first thing is systems are just more complex than ever, right? I keep iterating this, but I was reading recently about Netflix, and they've got something like 1,200 microservices. You go back 10, 15, 20 years, it was much more simple, right? You had a fit client desktop application, maybe it connected to a mainframe somewhere. It was a much simpler and cleaner architecture, right? Now we've got these huge multi-tiered architectured systems. We've got microservices all over the place. There's lots of teams involved who own particular different functions or components in an application. A lot of organizations are using third-party components as well. So you end up with this massive spider's web of, all the different pieces that are intertwined to create a system, right? And, it's a dream if you're an architect to look at this stuff, but for everyone else, it's a complete headache and a complete nightmare, right? I was working with a company recently, and they have this vast software landscape they've produced. And whenever they release a piece of software, they have to maintain it for minimum 10 years, maximum 20 years after they release it, right? And I know this is a particular organization, that's a particular, it's not the norm for every company, but just think about that for a second, right? You've got to maintain a piece of software for 20 years. A support ticket comes in for something you released 20 years ago. All of a sudden, because there's no documentation in place, or the documentation isn't, as good as it should be, whoever has been assigned that ticket, or whoever has been assigned to answer these particular questions or build the enhancement, has to down tools for days to go through and reverse engineer how that particular component works, just so you can move forward and answer the question or develop the feature that's needed, right? And that's madness. That's crazy, isn't it? So, to me, that just highlights why you need good documentation to a certain extent.
It's madness, but I think it's quite common, right? This is where we hear stories all the time, right? Around, and I think it's quite common that many organizations struggle to decommission anything.
Yeah,
right.
Sure.
And so what you get these. I think the organization you mentioned, they have a support agreement where they're supposed to do it. These organizations have got technical debt that they don't want, but they can't get rid of, right? And so what you find is you've got very important systems in the landscape of how the business runs that are still running on, they either don't understand the systems or they're running on very archaic platforms, right? The one that always springs to mind for me is an organization that financial services organization that essentially has a very important platform still running on Windows NT, right? And so they can't change it, they can't switch it off, because what else do you do? Right? And so I think it's quite a common thing where just, that whole maintenance, supportability, understanding just gets lost, right? And again, ultimately, you need to stay on top of these things.
Sorry, I'm laughing over here because do you remember when the whole CrowdStrike, was it CrowdStrike? I think that was it. Piece went on and all these IT systems went down. There was a few jokes about some organizations, not a customer, so I'll name them. It's publicly available on the internet. But it was Southwest Airlines. There was a big joke going around, a big meme saying, Southwest Airlines was still up because they were still using Windows 98 or 95 or something, right? Which wasn't impacted by the CrowdStrike update, and they were able to continue their business. And everyone believed it. I think like the New York Times picked it up, some of the other bigger papers. And then I think Southwest Airlines came out and they were like, no, actually, we use this system, blah, blah, blah. Obviously, we're not still winning Windows 95 in the background, but everyone believed it. And that just represents the IT landscape, right?
Yeah.
The other one, which I think is quite interesting, is we've just been going through an RFP, applying for it recently. And in that RFP, specifically for test data management, there is probably about 20 different database technologies listed, right? Or ERPs like Salesforce, ServiceNow, a couple other ones in there, S4HANA database, blah, blah, blah. And you look at that and that data landscape is ginormous. If you're coming at it from a compliance data governance point of view, all of a sudden, you're not going back 20 years where you're just looking at a couple of relational databases, maybe Oracle, SQL Server. You have a huge data landscape you have to take care of, right? And unless you've got good data cataloging, you've got good processes where you're understanding your data, you're going to really, really struggle with that, right? And I know there's a few symptoms listed here, but that has much, much bigger consequences where you're going into, financial consequences, business reputational consequences, and that's really painful, isn't it?
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's an interesting one in terms of you've got a whole gamut of risks you bring into scope in that scenario, right? In terms of understanding your data and data flows in terms of making change. That's the obvious one there. But you bring into scope, how are you going to make change if you don't keep on top of that data landscape? Well, you're probably going to use production data. And you've got a whole kind of data regulation remit in bringing into scope here in terms of, okay, so GDPR wise, you need to design your data with security in mind, right? So straight away, that's in scope. You can't use production source data for making change. You've got a whole data accuracy, data privacy thing going on. So it's a whole kind of ball of mud on top of ball of mud that you're bringing into scope by not addressing your basically your complexity and just evolving this thing over time. All right, we're gonna need to move on because we are possibly running out of time. So next one, we've talked about a lot of unknowns, right? And a lot of uncertainty, a lot of risk around not understanding certain things to make change. And so number 4 is reliance on manual processes, right? The solution to everything obviously is to try and automate everything, but how do you automate something you don't understand, hasn't got predictable outcomes, hasn't got repeatable outcomes, right? It's impossible, but yet many organizations are trying to implement DevOps pipelines, for example, or implement test automation, understanding that, or not understanding, as the case may be, that all of these underlying challenges exist. And what do you know? These things tend to fail. Yeah. So actually getting the right fundamentals in place in terms of the outer loop, how do you articulate repeatable, predictable outcomes, be that at requirements level or through to design level, and how does that then manifest itself through to implementation and proving afterwards, i.e. testing? If you've got the right fundamentals in place, you've got those two things, which are repeatable and predictable. I'll keep reiterating these things. then you have the right conditions in place to actually start doing effective automation. But most organizations don't do that very simple thing. James, over to you.
Yeah, I think I completely agree. I think there's two ends of the spectrum here, right? There's a lot of organizations who should be automating processes and really struggling with that. But I've also seen it on the other side where there's like a hard and fast strategy that we have to automate everything. And that ends up becoming a really big mess really quickly as well, right? And I think I almost used to have that mindset as well. And now I've come to the conclusion that actually, manual processes are okay. There's nothing wrong with that. People should not be ashamed for having manual processes. It's perfectly acceptable. It's fine. I think when it does become a problem is when you start doing the same thing on repeat. If you're running the same manual process and you've got people doing that, once a week, twice a week, daily, it's probably time to start thinking about automating, right? And there's enough tools that can help with that these days. There's enough knowledge out there. The hardest bit, as you say, is getting the SME knowledge of the systems, the business processes to be able to automate it. The actual automation execution is pretty easy usually, but figuring out what to automate, that is really the hard bit, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I just to touch on that, and interestingly, it's a conversation we've had on a previous podcast. It's a bit of a plug there. We as technologists look for technology as a solution far too often, right? I.e., let's automate. When actually the most effective thing we could do is probably understand what the challenge really is. And if I take the example of testing, for example, there's a hell of a lot of duplication and waste in what we test today, and therefore the most effective and efficient thing we could do in test is understand what we could just throw away, and then work on the things that we need to keep as important to both make them predictable, stable, and then automate them. All right. But we will save far more time by throwing away things that offer no value than we ever would through the automation. But yet that doesn't seem to be the focus. Okay. Last one in terms of our top 5 of 10, poor productivity, satisfaction, and retention. All right, so this just compounds the problem that we've already been talking about, right? In terms of all of these things that exist, they just make us slower, right? We have to almost reinvent the wheel or rediscover, do archaeology each time we want to make change because we haven't got a grip on what we're supposed to be doing or how the system works today. And it's a real challenge, right? The one I will pick out here is actually there is a big hero culture going on in a lot of IT change, where we've already mentioned the SMEs that have a lot of head knowledge, and therefore they become a bottleneck in terms of articulating how things should work, telling teams what change or what they need to be aware of, and that's a big challenge. What we find is a lot of teams we talk to are almost disillusioned or in a hopeless place that that's the way that it has always been, and therefore we're kind of stuck in this mode of working. Lots of people, and I'm sure people on this webinar, we're not telling you anything new. We're just telling you stuff that kind of is what it is, right? And therefore we live with it. Actually, what we're saying here, in you don't have to live with it, right? The outer loop things shouldn't be like that, and there are actually effective ways to start to address it and to start to talk about these challenges so that broader stakeholders can be aware of them and actually start to manage them more effectively to ultimately make the whole flow through IT change a lot more effective. James.
Yeah, I think the word compound is a good choice there, Rich, for sure. I think it absolutely does compound. I think with Agile, it almost exponentially compounds, because as soon as it starts going wrong, it's really hard to catch back up again, right? And I think what I mean by that is, if your back's against the wall, you're getting support tickets coming in because you have poor quality. You're always firefighting step 1 issues. Everything we've said previously, right? You've got growing complexity, you've got growing technical debt. It doesn't get easier unless you take a step back and you start to address those problems, right? And I think, software development, software delivery, it's not a hard job physically, but mentally it can be incredibly challenging, right? If you've got support tickets coming in left, right, and center, you've got a KPI being tracked like mean time to resolution. I'm really surprised you don't see more organizations, more teams with burnout as a result of that, right? Because if it's not going right and you're not taking a step back to address it and set yourself up for success, it does compound. It gets worse, it gets more stressful, and it's really hard to get out of that hole, right? And I genuinely think that's what it is, right? Like you spoke about change earlier, Rich, but I think when things start to go bad, the solution is not to have this hero mentality of we're going to start working more, we're going to, expect our employees to start cranking out 12-hour days, we're going to put more pressure on them, or we're going to go out and hire more developers to increase bandwidth. Often the answer is this process is not working. Something is going wrong. Either we've got too many defects going out, or we've got to trace all the way back to the root cause. But often it's let's look at our inner outer loop, let's take a step back, down tools, and really address the root causes so that we can start becoming successful again and almost start winning as software delivery, right? Otherwise, it's such a mess. And you see so many organizations in that, I guess, right, where they're really struggling. I guess you've seen the same as well, Rich.
Absolutely, it's a vicious circle, and this is where almost it's mythical man month in terms of let's throw people at it. Let's like as you say, let's do longer hours. It just doesn't work, and it's certainly not sustainable over multiple change either, right? And so it's important to raise the challenges that we've discussed here today around these are the things that are actually slowing us down, rather than kind of taking superficial solutions, maybe right in the short term as a one-off, but actually as a sustainable long-term change strategy, you've got to address these things.
Yeah, absolutely, Rich. I think that tees up nicely for the next slide here, if I can get it right. Yeah, this one. So I think you're absolutely right there, Rich. Like going full circle and looking at these 5 challenges we've kind of spoken about today, I think what I generally end up seeing to these 5 challenges is organizations almost adopt these kind of fast painkiller solutions, right? So if we pick out a few of these, testing is too slow, we're relying too much on manual processes, let's introduce automation. We're so reliant on hero hiring, we can't hire good enough developers, we can't find good enough developers in the marketplace. We're always firefighting step 1 issues, so let's go out and hire more people so we can increase our bandwidth, right? These are all examples of kind of painkiller, fast, quick solutions that actually don't take a step back and go to the root cause of why have we got ourselves in this mess in the first place, right? And I think just coming back to what we were talking about at the beginning, a lot of the reason why we're seeing a lot of these challenges we're talking about is fundamentally organizations in 2024, 2023 have been over-investing in their inner loop, over-investing in development, and not been paying enough attention in the outer loop, right? They've not been paying enough attention in requirements. They've not been paying enough attention in testing. They've not been paying enough attention and investing in data, environments, and maintenance as a result of that, right? And you'll see here, we've got this kind of, seesaw where the inner loop is much heavier than the outer loop. Organizations are investing in that, and there's an imbalance, right, that we spoke about at the beginning. So how do you solve that? How do you move forward? How can we get to a better place? And that's really why Curiosity have come up with this inner outer loop concept, right? We're trying to strip back to the root causes and help organizations almost get a sense of understanding of why are we experiencing these pains? Why are we experiencing these challenges? How can we move forward and solve them? I think the number 1 piece that I think has huge impact in organizations is starting with good requirements. If you start with bad requirements, you're setting yourself up for failure. Why would you not invest a little bit earlier, invest in your requirements so that everything else becomes way easier downstream, right? Your testers know exactly how this software should work, so they know how to test it. Your developers know what should be built, so they can look at that requirements, they can understand it, and they can move forward with it, right? And everything from that. Your COE, your test data engineers know what data they need for the requirements before they're even starting to write a line of code. And that's hugely impactful, right? And I think if you do more in your requirements earlier, you can really set yourself up for success and improve quality throughout software delivery. One of the approaches we've seen huge success with is with something we call visual modeling. And that's basically where you're moving away from these textual static documents that Rich was talking about earlier into having visual diagrams which represent requirements which can then be used to auto-generate test cases and enhance quality throughout software delivery. The second one here is continuous artifact generation. Now, that's quite a complex statement, but again, really what we're talking about here is shifting left, okay? So we're talking about, instead of generating your test cases and performing your testing really late in the delivery lifecycle, we're talking about doing that much earlier. So essentially, as soon as your requirements start to formulate, you should have your test cases and you should have everything in a row, that before you even start writing a line of code, you have your data, you have your test cases, you have your environments, everything is lined up, ready to go. So your developers aren't having to leave this state of flow that they're getting in, right? And I think often what we see in organizations is testing data, it's a very reactive process. The testing team is always reacting to new features coming out in a UAT environment. The data center of excellence or the data engineers are always reacting to new data requests that are coming through. And what we're saying here is be proactive, set yourself up for success, do more earlier and get all your ducks in a row. And what you should find as part of that is you actually start to have continuous quality, because all of a sudden your organization has everything they need early. Everyone understands what the definition of quality is, and people can collaborate on that throughout the software delivery lifecycle. Now, the fourth one here, I think, is really, really important. And, I keep saying this, but I genuinely think test data is a silent killer in organizations, because if you don't have the right data available, you can't develop against certain scenarios. You can't test against the scenarios you need. And what I've seen in a lot of organizations is developers or testers go out and they end up having to hack data together. They end up downing tools. They spend their precious time trying to piece together all the data they need to perform their roles against, right? And that's not a great use of their time, to be frank. We need our developers focusing on being productive. We need to have all the test data there so that we can test against it and improve quality. But then the other end of this is, we're just going to fall back onto production data, right? And that has huge risks. Production data should not be seen as a central source of truth. You look at the coverage that's behind production data, it's incredibly low. So, to me, these are four big issues that I think going into 2025, if you don't have these in place, number one, I would take a real hard look at your requirements and see what can I do to improve my requirement definition, how my organization is able to consume requirements efficiently and quickly. But secondly, my test data as well. How can I make data available across the organization, especially now we have such a dispersed nature of systems, right? And these are areas that Curiosity is specifically focused in. So we at Curiosity have basically formulated what I would call the world's first outer loop platform. We have built a platform which is specifically focused on this outer loop of delivery. So we have technology that can help organizations create really good requirements that are consumable by everyone in software delivery. We can generate test cases before a single line of code is written. We can help you get all the test data you need into your environment so that you have all the data there you need to develop and test against. And then also we can help reduce the burden of technical debt because you've got living documentation that flows through as you're going through sprint on sprint. And we've seen some enormous results with this in organizations. All of a sudden that organization is going from having their sprints delayed to actually being, on track with their sprints or even potentially delivering early, right? We've seen people have less of a reliance on having to go to the market and make these hero hires. We've seen organizations reduce the amount of defects that are being leaked into their production environment, right? And we've seen a lot of value in organizations by shifting energy from the inner loop into the outer loop. So I'm going to hand back to Mantas. I know we're exactly at the hour, which is well timed.
Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thank you, James. Thank you, Rich, for presenting. Really, really good discussions there. Really good presentation on the 5 challenges and the 4 points to overcome those challenges, right? So I'd like to say thank you for everyone for joining. I'd like to just give a quick shout out to a survey that we're doing with Curiosity, doing a bit of research, and we'd love for you to take part. So there will be a link in the email follow-up, and there's currently a link on your screen. So if you'd love to take part to discuss how your organization is tackling inner and outer loop challenges and so forth, please, please do fill in the little survey. It only takes about 5 minutes. So yeah, thank you for your help there. And then, yeah, finally, I'd just love to say huge thank you for everyone and for James and Rich for presenting today. I think we had a really good presentation, as I said. If you have any more questions, if you'd like to reach out, please don't be afraid and get in touch with Rich or James on LinkedIn, or you can follow up, email me back, and the follow-up you'll get tomorrow. Again, you will receive the recording and the slides tomorrow. So yeah, finally, if you want to keep up to date with other Curiosity events, webinars, please do follow us on LinkedIn, visit our website, or check out our YouTube. So without further ado, I'd like to say thank you again to everyone. And yeah, thank you for joining. See you next time. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Have a good day. Bye-bye.